The gravel crunched under the tires of the sheriff's cruiser as it sped toward me. A woman in a bright pink visor was already out of her car, pointing with the fury of someone convinced they'd just caught a fugitive. Her face was twisted in rage as she shouted that I was trespassing on private property. The two deputies approached cautiously, their hands resting on their duty belts. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair at the temples, spoke with crisp authority. "Sir, we're going to need to see some ID. This woman says you're not supposed to be here." I moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for my wallet. "Officers," I said calmly, handing them my license along with another card. "I own this land, and I'm Federal Judge Marcus Henderson." The shift in their expressions was instant. As for the woman in the visor, whose name I'd later learn was Patricia Thornfield, though she insisted everyone call her Patricia, not Pat, not Patty, her righteous fire flickered. For a second, she seemed to deflate, but only briefly. Her eyes narrowed as she recalculated, already scheming her next move. 3 weeks earlier, I had finally closed on the ranch I'd dreamed of for years. 40 pristine acres in the Texas hill country, bordering the elite Rolling Hills estates. The place was infamous for having one of the most aggressive HOAs in the state. I'd heard the horror stories, but none of it applied to me. My property sat outside their jurisdiction. No deed restrictions, no covenants. It was mine, free and clear. I kept a low profile, visiting just once a month to check in on renovations to the old farmhouse and meet with my contractor. But Patricia Thornfield had other plans. As president of the Rolling Hills HOA for 7 years running, she ruled her neighborhood with an iron fist disguised in a velvet glove of phony politeness. The first time I met her, I was unloading supplies from my truck when she marched right over the property line, clipboard in hand, pink visor gleaming. "Excuse me," she said in a voice sharp enough to slice through steel. "I don't believe we've met," she said, that artificial smile plastered across her face. "I'm Patricia Thornfield, president of the Rolling Hills Homeowners Association. And you are?" I introduced myself simply as Marcus and explained I'd recently purchased the ranch. Her grin stayed frozen, but her eyes were already sweeping my land like a hawk scouring for prey. "Well, Marcus, I'm sure you'll want to bring this property up to our community standards. That fence is looking quite shabby. And is that a livestock trailer? We have very strict policies about commercial vehicles," I replied politely, letting her know that my land wasn't part of the HOA. That's when the smile cracked. "Perhaps. Not officially," she said, her tone laced with implication, as if she knew something I didn't. "But as neighbors, we expect a certain level of cooperation. I'll send you our guidelines for reference." She spun around, her heels clicking against the dirt, and strode back to her spotless white Range Rover, leaving me standing there, already wondering what kind of storm I had invited into my life. The harassment started small. Official-looking notices began appearing on my gate, citing obscure code violations, ones that didn't even apply to my land. Anonymous complaints were filed with the city, claiming loud livestock noises, even though I hadn't brought a single animal to the property. Then came the letters from the HOA's attorney, full of vague legalese, suggesting that maybe there was some confusion over the property lines. They strongly recommended I join the HOA voluntarily, to avoid any unfortunate misunderstandings. I ignored it all. Each ridiculous document went into a folder I'd labeled Patricia's Nonsense. But Patricia wasn't used to being ignored. One morning, I arrived to find a massive metal gate installed across the access road. It had a gleaming new lock and a sign declaring it private HOA property. The issue? That road was a public easement, one that had existed for more than 50 years. I immediately contacted the sheriff's department to report the obstruction, but Patricia had planned for that too. She had already filed a claim with the county, alleging the easement had been abandoned, and that the HOA had assumed control of it for security reasons. It was going to take weeks, maybe longer, to untangle this mess through official channels. So, I did what any reasonable landowner would do. I cut the lock. That's when Patricia called 911, shrieking into the phone about a dangerous trespasser destroying HOA property. Which brings us to the present moment. 2 sheriffs, deputies standing in front of me trying to make sense of the situation, trying to process the fact that they'd just been dispatched to arrest a federal judge for accessing his own land. "Judge Henderson," the senior deputy said, choosing his words carefully, "I apologize for the confusion. Can you explain what's going on?" I gave them the short version, while Patricia fumed in the background, still ranting about destruction of property and criminal trespass. The deputies looked over my deed, made a few calls, and quickly confirmed what I already knew. The road was a public easement. The HOA had zero authority to block it. The deputy turned to Patricia. "Ma'am," he said, firm but professional, "you need to remove this gate immediately. Installing it was illegal, and you could be facing charges for obstructing a public right-of-way." Patricia's face turned an alarming shade of purple. "This is ridiculous. I know the law. My husband is an attorney." She grabbed her phone and began furiously texting. "You'll be hearing from our legal team," she snapped. But the deputies weren't about to let her walk away that easily. They made her wait as they supervised the full removal of the gate, right down to the last bolt. Still, Patricia wasn't finished. Over the next week, I was served with a lawsuit, filed by the HOA, claiming I had violated numerous covenants and restrictions, damaged HOA property, and caused emotional distress to several board members. It was laughable on its face. I wasn't even part of the HOA, but even frivolous lawsuits demand time, and money, and lawyers. That's when I decided to dig deeper into the Rolling Hills HOA itself. And what I found was interesting. Very interesting. Turns out the HOA had been established 20 years ago, but the founding documents were full of irregularities. The original covenants never properly recorded with the county. The voting procedures used to form the HOA didn't even meet basic state requirements. And most damning of all were the discrepancies in the financial records, signs that HOA funds were being misused. To avoid any appearance of conflict, I formally recused myself from any legal proceedings involving the HOA. But as a private citizen, I took action. I filed a complaint with the State Attorney General's office. Then I reached out to several homeowners in Rolling Hills, people I'd heard had suffered under Patricia's iron rule. What I uncovered was staggering. Homeowners fined thousands of dollars for using the wrong shade of beige on their mailboxes. Elderly residents dragged before the board to explain why their grass was a half-inch too long during a drought. Family with a disabled child threatened with liens because they installed a wheelchair ramp, even though it was required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. One by one, the victims came forward. A forensic audit was ordered, and it revealed Patricia had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, cleverly labeling them as administrative costs. The HOA's attorney? None other than Patricia's brother-in-law, charging far above market rates for routine paperwork. Elections had been a sham for years. Patricia had counted the ballots herself and conveniently lost any evidence of opposition. But once the subpoenas began arriving, the board started to fracture. Patricia's inner circle, once loyal to a fault, began to scatter. Board members resigned in waves, each bringing new testimony of her manipulation and misconduct. The woman, who had ruled her neighborhood like a tyrant for 7 years, was watching her kingdom collapse in slow motion. Still, Patricia tried to keep up appearances. She arrived at board meetings in her trademark pink visor, smiling as if nothing were wrong, but the cracks were impossible to miss. Her hands trembled as she banged the gavel to call meetings to order. Her voice broke when she read the treasurer's report, and when the process servers knocked on her door with federal documents in hand. Neighbors say they heard screaming, loud, hysterical, sobs, echoing from inside her once pristine colonial home. The case moved faster than anyone expected. The state attorney general's office, now working alongside federal authorities due to evidence of mail and wire fraud, built an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. Not only had the HOA been improperly established, Patricia had been defrauding homeowners for years. The misused funds alone totaled more than $200,000. On a bright Thursday morning, the courtroom was packed wall to wall with Rolling Hills residents. Patricia sat silently at the defendant's table, her signature pink visor absent. Instead, she wore a conservative gray suit that did little to hide the panic in her eyes. Her brother-in-law, the same one who had served as the HOA's attorney, had withdrawn from the case, citing a conflict of interest. She was left with a public defender who looked completely overwhelmed by the scope of the charges. The presiding judge, a respected colleague of mine from the district court, reviewed the findings in calm, methodical detail. The HOA had been formed in violation of state law, its covenants invalid, its elections fraudulent, and the financial misconduct extensive and deliberate. With every revelation, Patricia seemed to shrink lower in her chair. Then came the verdict. Courtroom fell silent. This court finds, the judge announced, that the Rolling Hills Homeowners Association was never legally constituted and is hereby dissolved. All lines, fines, and assessments issued under its name are void. He turned to Patricia. Furthermore, Patricia Thornfield is found guilty of wire fraud, mail fraud, and embezzlement. The gavel struck with a sharp, final crack. For a moment, the room was frozen. Then a wave of cheers erupted, from homeowners who had endured years under Patricia's iron grip. But the judge wasn't done. "Mrs. Thornfield," he continued, "you are hereby sentenced to 48 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $237,000 to the affected homeowners." Patricia sat motionless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She turned toward the gallery, searching desperately for a sympathetic face, but found only the steely gazes of those she had bullied, fined, and humiliated. When the bailiff stepped forward with the handcuffs, something inside her broke. She began to sob, loud, heaving, uncontrollable sobs as they led her away.